Hey everyone, and welcome back to the second day of the Central Bank of Armenia and Better Policy Project conference. I hope everyone had a nice lunch, and I suggest we get right back into it with a panel on developing the Mark II framework for monetary policy designed to avoid dark corners, which are extreme economic outcomes, such as, for example, a banking or currency crisis. Now, in this panel, we have a couple of great experts for you, starting with John Simon, Adjunct Fellow, Macquarie University, Australia, who has a long track record at the Reserve Bank of Australia and IMF. Then we have Martin Wheel, who is a professor of economics at King's College in the UK and was an external member of the Monetary Policy Committee at the Bank of England. We also have Doug Lexton, president at the Better Policy Project, who previously worked at the Bank of Canada, and Ani Asuryan, who is a macroeconomist at the Central Bank of Armenia. Then we have Armen Nurbekyan, deputy governor at the Central Bank of Armenia, and Levon Sahakyan, board member of the Central Bank of Armenia and associate professor of the Armenian State University of Economics. And we're focusing specifically on dark corners and also with its relations to the Bernanke report that came out last year about the Bank of England and how they could improve their use of their big pool of talent, their tools, use of their data, but also criticize them for using outdated models and a lack of scenario analysis. So let's start with John. Can you maybe enlighten us on this subject?
Yeah, so I am somewhat of a ring-in the sense that until a few weeks ago, I didn't really know what this FPAS Mark II is. I come from a central bank where I don't know if you could really claim we even do FPAS Mark I at the Reserve Bank of Australia. So in some senses, my appreciation for everything that FPAS Mark II has got going for it is seeing the absence and what that leads to in the way monetary policy is conducted. And so what I've really, the bottom line is that when I look at all the things that have been discussed in this conference and what's set out in it, I think this is great. This is what I think monetary policy should be doing. And I think the key element, which is in there, but is something that I've been thinking about in the way we conduct monetary policy and have discussions at the RBA, is the human element. I think too often people get hung up on models, and are you using a semi-structural model? Are you using a DSGE? What's the data? What are our forecasts like? What are the scenarios we're doing? When really the key element in decision making is how do you control the people in it? How do you provide them with information and take account of the fact that they've got biases? We're human. We've probably all read Thinking Fast and Slow, and we all kind of come to this realization that despite the fact that we might like to think of ourselves, many of us as rational economists, we're not rational. And I think the beauty of the FPAS system that the Bank of Armenia is putting forward is the idea that it can take account of people and construct a system that really has people and the way they think about things and how you do that at the center of it, rather than the models at the center of it. Because we have this idea that if you just are rational enough and use a good enough model, or you have a process that is good enough, we'll get much better monetary policy. But I think if you don't account for the humans in the loop, you will really probably always feel yourself a little bit disappointed by the process. So that's the key element that I see in it, is that. And, so that's where I really hear this good thing, because when I looked at what was going on at the RBA, we had, limited models. And the biggest problem was, how do you manage that whole process to get people to make the right decisions? And part of it is giving them the information. But really, it's about controlling the inputs and giving you an environment where, despite your human frailties, you can come up with a good decision. And so I think that's really, the key element of it. And then I can perhaps go into some details about how I see that in terms of managing uncertainty. But the fundamental thing, I think, is people are really bad at managing uncertainty. We like to pretend that we can analyze risk, but I don't think we can. And so once you acknowledge that, you realize that, for example, you need a committee, for example, to perhaps represent different certainties rather than having the idea that one particular person can somehow encapsulate in their mind multiple different uncertainties. So I'll leave that as my kind of opening statement of the key element is the person in the loop.
Right. Thank you so much. I think that was a great opening. Are there some panelists that want to respond to the opening so far?
So thank you. Nice to see John and Martin and others. So the way I'm going to try and answer this question is ask Ben Bernanke put out the report in the Bank of England. Many of the points that he makes are applicable to all central banks trying to do these things. There were a couple of recommendations I want to focus on. And it's sort of related a little bit to what John just said. There is one page in the summary that has a very, very long list of things, including macro financial, labor markets. And my first reaction to that, from my experience building models and advising people to build models, is that anybody that's ever tried to build a model that has half of that stuff in it has never succeeded, and so on. So right now, people are looking at the Bernanke report and trying to figure out what did he mean. And so I hope he didn't mean trying to go off and build a model that had everything in it. I think what the purpose of that slide was to explain that is the knowledge base that you need. And that you need to have a lot of supporting research. When I think of a model for doing monetary policy, I think of other characteristics than finding the true model. I think of trying to develop a model and a process where people can go home at 6 o'clock and not work all night long, trying to get the model to produce something sensible. So my experience is that to the Bank of England, looking at the report, is to think very clearly what goes in the core model and what is left out, and what other satellite models or research are going to be necessary to cover everything in that slide. The other thing, the other point that I'll make is that, and this has to do with human capital, because I'm sure that people that read the Bernanke report will not really have a good idea what he meant when he said they need more seasoned PhDs. My interpretation of what he said is we need to have the best PhDs in the world. The example that I would give would be the Fed. They can hire the best of the best. They hire them from top-notch schools and so on. So I think, I hope that's what Ben Bernanke meant by that. Now, when these the best of the best PhDs go to the Fed, the board, they do that obviously because they have much more time than staying at Harvard or MIT or Princeton to start publishing papers and doing really great research. So they go to the board for that, and then there's a big pool of talent of the greatest macroeconomists in the world, and from that pool of talent, they draw on the ones that are interested to do production work. Now, what's interesting, you might even say mind-boggling, is that when the rest of the world now, after they've failed implementing DSG models and any kind of model, they look to the Fed, the Fed's model, FRBUS, as a great model because it was designed for forecasting. This is what is so nonsensical. The FRBUS has never been used for generating a baseline forecast. Don Cohn made it illegal decades ago to use any model for forecasting. His argument is that, and it's very much related to what John said, his argument for doing that is that if you had a model and you use that extensively for forecasting, you would lose all the color in all the narratives. And he was very, very concerned about that. A decade ago, 15 years ago, something like that, I talked to Don and said, well, we do have a better way of doing this. We invest in developing a model, and then we add judgment to the model. And that's a way of adding macroeconomic consistency and so on. And anyway, he wasn't persuaded in that. You can imagine the staff at the Fed were very persuaded in that, because it probably would have saved him a lot of resources. You can imagine putting a forecast together with so many people, okay? You know, how time intensive that would be, and how you would have to impose macroeconomic policy consistency. In other words, you have to have the interest rate that's consistent with the scenario. You'd have to have output, inflation, labor markets, the term structure. It all would have to be consistent. And so the question is, you know, the way we think about it, you do that with a model, it's quite easy, and you add judgment onto it. But he didn't agree with that. He retired from the Fed quite some time ago. And because this fact that I just told you is not widely known at all, I sent an email to Bob Tetlow at the Fed asking, is it still the case that they are not allowed to use models to produce forecasts? And he did. So he sent back, and sure enough, you can't use models to produce forecasts at the Fed. You need to have people do that. Okay, so that's very important, because I think one of the problems of reading the Bernanke report is that many people will say, or have been captured by this model says kind of methodology in academia, which I don't disagree with, by the way. I think it's perfectly okay for academia. I'm teaching my graduate class with models and so on, but to develop professional economists, I think what Don is absolutely right, that if you're going to do the best job, people are more important than models. Now, at the Fed, after that baseline forecast is constructed, they then use FPAS to basically back out, you know, what all the shocks would be, or add factors, or whatever you want to call them. And then from that, they can then consider alternative scenarios. And obviously having models speeds up that process enormously. Last thing I would say, again, John, back to people. At the Central Bank of Armenia, we have Heike Vetsian, who's the head of the macro directorate. And so he has come up with he's head of research and statistics and other departments. So he's come up with a very special HR model, along with the HR department and myself. And it's a 624, where you have these 4 teams of 6 people. And the idea is that 6 people can do everything, like all the production work. And then you have the other 3 6-person teams acting as either a backup. So if something goes wrong with one of those 6 people, you can pull in somebody from the next team. Or those teams are actively doing research, preparing to take their turn doing production. So it's like a rolling thing where each one of the teams takes care of all the scenario building for FPAS Mark II. So the advantages of that, of course, are that if you're only doing production 3 months of the year, okay, you'll have to be a backup, and the other 6 months you'll have to be making preparations. The idea behind that is all based on people, that if you do it that way, we will be able to attract a lot more talent because we won't burn them out by working them into production for long periods of time. So what's neat, after a year, we haven't achieved the full 24 yet. That will happen obviously over the next few years because it will take a time to build up the stock. We currently only have about a dozen or so. But we think that that is an amazing model to follow. What I did, along with my son, Jared, actually I asked him to do it, was to ask if you were going to implement a 624 in advanced economies, like the Bank of England, how many resources would it take? And so we said, well, how many would 24 people cost? And so the wages that we used, we said, well, you know, these are going to be the best of the best. They will have to compete with the IMF and the Fed. So let's make their wages, you know, really high. IMF wages are pretty high. You incorporate the benefits. It's a lot of money. But what we showed is that with a 624 in an advanced economy, plus ample budgets for things like IT and so on, that it would be impossible for us to spend more than $10 million. And so that is substantially smaller than what most advanced economy central banks spend currently. Yeah, maybe 5, sometimes even 10 times that. And so, John, back to your people thing, I presume, do you want the best of the best people and the best of the best frameworks? Because currently we think it's 624. We had an interesting discussion yesterday when talking about AI. And so we currently built FPAS Mark II without any AI whatsoever, but we're training people now with AI. And obviously there will be a big productivity gain, we think. Now that's, of course, assuming that the AI doesn't make us lazy. So we had a suggestion last night from Armin Nerbekian, where he said, why don't we have 2 groups, one that work with AI and another group that doesn't work with AI as well. And so that would take, if you wanted a system like that, that was 624, that would mean $20 million. And so, you know, when you start thinking about this and you say, well, how would you possibly use all those resources that advanced economy central banks right now are doing? You could think, well, this would be a way of implementing responsible AI, where you pick people that don't want to work with AI and have them form these 4 6-person groups, and then you have another group that exploits the power of AI. So thank you.
Well, perhaps I'll add an observation that when you talk about the best of the best, I think the key quality is actually a personality. It's not strictly humility. I mean, yes, humility is part of it, but self-awareness, I think, might be the best description of it. That you understand yourself, you understand the way you think. And I don't know that necessarily the graduates from the top programs in the US that the Fed can hire are necessarily the sole source of that. I think, yes, there is a certain level of technical understanding you need, but I think that helps you to understand your own thinking as much as it does anything else. And so I would think that the best of the best in terms of who you want doing monetary policy are people who can actually recognize their own biases, recognize their own ways of thinking, and then use models appropriately as a way of constraining their thinking, but not limiting it and guiding it, just as a way of disciplining their thinking. And that's, I think, a quality that you're looking for in policymakers, because there needs to be pragmatism and a humility about it. But if you've got the best PhD, a lot of people with the best PhDs end up getting quite enamored with their techniques.
I mean, could I offer a thought on that, please? That my observation at the Bank of England, admittedly 10 years ago now, was that there was also quite a helpful role to be played by people who were brought in from outside, typically from commercial organizations who had been forecasting and were able to cast a view over what was going on and what they thought was important. I mean, this isn't to say that the sort of expertise that we've been discussing is unnecessary, quite the opposite. But I think there are other skills that you also need to be helpful in monetary policy setting.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. Anyone from the panel want to respond? And otherwise, I think we can go to Martin's slide.
I just wanted to respond to John and ask, so what does this mean if you were going to look for these people, John? What kind of strategy would you have? Would they still have PhDs and masters or undergraduates? So how would you go about doing this?
Well, I suppose part of my reaction was a lot of us in smaller countries like Australia don't actually have the luxury of being able to recruit people on the North American job market. We might pick up a few people here and there. And in Australia, we actually pick up people who've got honours degrees or the equivalent of masters. And I think there is the idea that if you put them in an environment, you can grow it. You can build that kind of way of thinking. PhDs build a certain way of thinking, but if you are very conscious about it in the way that you run your policy processes and the culture you build in your institution, I think you can build it in your recruits. So you want them to have, you certainly want them to be technically capable. I think that is an absolute necessity. But that's not the sole thing that you're looking for. And then what you really need is, to be thinking consciously about how do you encourage people to develop that right balance between self-knowledge, humility, and really thinking about the process and how that influences the outcomes. And you can do that if you've got a very productive culture within an institution. And what you need as the raw materials then is the people who've got a reasonable level of technical skills, but they don't necessarily have to have gone to the best North American programs.
I think I'd rather agree with John on that there is a range of experiences which is needed, and there are a number of ways in which it can be developed. And a PhD and doing well in a PhD in one of the leading universities is only one of those ways.
Yeah. Is there anyone from the Central Bank of Armenia on the panel that wants to contribute with their experience from last year on this? For example, Ani or Armin or Levon?
Yeah, maybe. I'll be. I think if you think about the Bernanke report, and I think Martin is going to have a more structured way of talking about the report since he had the presentation. So I'm just going to be do a quick review and connect it to our experience. I think if you look at the Bernanke report, essentially on a very high level, it has several parts. Number one, I would call a general hygiene for modeling data and maintenance of things, which I think is good to have. You need to have a regular look, thinking about the models, making sure you have maintenance data in place, the processes are not cumbersome and all that. So I think that is straightforward. The second part is more or less the sort of the human capital part, which I think 90%. I think most of it are things that I disagree with. And the last part is basically the risk management part, which is recommendation 7 to 12, so to speak, which is about talking about the risk management. How will you how do you emphasize more the risks? How do you talk about alternative scenarios, getting rid of fan charts and all that? So this is basically exactly what we have been doing at FPAS Mark II. And so I will discuss this in details a bit later after Martin's presentation. But I think so. But what I don't agree in the human capital part is exactly what I think the people who spoke before me have been mentioning, because I think there, at least my interpretation was that the panacea was to really bring the PhDs from the great universities, and they are gonna basically make everything magically better. I think this is there was too much emphasis on that. I think in Bernanke's report, I'm a bit exaggerating, of course, to make the point. But I think this is exactly the opposite of our experience, because we don't see any negative or positive correlation in a sense, because at the end of the day, it's the selection of people who want to do something interesting. So I totally agree with John. So we know, so we have met lots of great PhDs who were absolutely not good people, but not suitable for policy analysis. We had people who had no PhDs, but at no time found ways to actually get into the policy analysis because they really cared about policy. And, we also had great PhDs who have great technical details, and at the same time, we were able to do the policy. So I think there is no correlation, but absolutely having the PhDs and the greatest technical knowledge is not the most important factor for policymaking institutions and for monetary policy. And this is something that we have been seeing. In fact, in some cases, too much technical detail can actually hurt you, because especially in the FPAS Mark II, and this is again our experiences, one of the most valuable things is that you can actually intertine different scenarios. So think a bit outside of the box and not get married to one line or technical, underlying details. And in many cases, people are very heavily technical. It's very difficult to do. So that's our experience as well. So I think I agree with most of the parts of Bernanke report. I agree, but I disagree with the human capital part. I think too much emphasis on that. And I also share what Doug said in the beginning. I also sort of got the impression that in terms of the modeling, Bernanke's recommendation sounded like take all this complicated energy, financial sector, and all of that stuff and put in one model, and it's gonna solve your problems. I think that also, is a bit of a dangerous path to take. And I'll stop here.
Thank you. I think you already made somewhat of an introduction for Martin's presentation. What do you think, Martin? Is this the perfect time to share your presentation?
Yes, I think so, assuming I can get it to share this time. Am I sharing properly?
Yes, we see it.
Okay, thank you very much. Now let's hope that I can advance the slides. So I wanted to start by talking about the background of the Monetary Policy Committee, because my view is that the way in which the Monetary Policy Committee operates, and both the structure in which it's set up and the way in which politicians have got used to expectations of what they're looking for from the committee, do have an influence on the way the committee needs to, or the way methods of working might need to change. And I rather thought the consideration of that was rather missing from the Bernanke report, which seemed to me, to sum it up, said become more like the Federal Reserve Board. And it was perhaps a bit difficult to avoid observing that the superstructure that Bernanke described in the Federal Reserve Board didn't actually help it very much with the issue that led to this concern about modelling and forecasting, i.e. the complete failure to anticipate the inflation of 2021, 2022 that faded in 2023. Bernanke does talk about forecasting records, and the Bank of England was certainly not the best in the world, but it wasn't disastrous either. So that, I think, does raise the question, should we expect the sort of changes that Bernanke recommended actually to help? Anyway, how does the Monetary Policy Committee operate? The Bank of England was given operational independence in 1997 when the Monetary Policy Committee was set up. There are 5 internal members, the governor, who of course chairs the committee, 3 deputy governors and the chief economists, and then there are 4 external members, of whom I was one. The external members are appointed for 3-year terms and renewable once. The inflation target is set by the Chancellor of the Exchequer or by Parliament, depending how you want to look at it, but it's set exogenously once each year. And there is this rather Delphic statement in the instructions given by the Chancellor to the Monetary Policy Committee that inflation may, although the target applies at all times, inflation may deviate from the target, and sometimes the costs of keeping it close to the target would be too high. Mervyn King was very clear when this arrangement was set up, that was when he was chief economist at the bank before he became governor, that it would only fly if there was individual accountability, and putting the decision-making power in the hands of the governor would be something that Parliament would be unlikely to agree to. Well, that wasn't tested, of course, because the structure was set up in a framework with 9 people voting and the individual votes being reported. And a key feature of that was that members are individually accountable for their decisions. So if I voted in a minority, I had to explain why I was voting in a minority rather than why the committee collectively was doing what it did. The minutes of the committee meeting are published with the announcement. Well, obviously that means that they have to be prepared a couple of days ahead of the announcement. Transcripts of individual statements at the decision meeting are now released after a delay of 8 years. When we discussed that while I was still on the committee, I was quite keen on immediate release, but the concern was that immediate release would lead to grandstanding and people saying things in the meeting that perhaps in the public eye would be designed to focus attention on them. Well, since that wasn't tested, I don't know whether it was a risk or not. What about the forecast? The structure at the Bank of England, at the Monetary Policy Committee, is that the MPC produces forecasts of GDP, inflation and unemployment 4 times a year. The forecast is produced using a market path for interest rates and a range of other conditioning assumptions. The forecast, of course, there's normally only a single forecast, that's the best collective judgment of the MPC, but during preparations, members sometimes vote on particular issues. And when the forecast is complete, the staff prepare a range of forecasts for other variables consistent with the MPC forecast. The way in which the forecast is prepared does actually matter. So when I joined the committee, the issue of supply was taken to be very simple. Supply was growing at 2% a year. That was the world we had thought we were in. And the question was what was happening to demand and how did that have implications for inflation? Well, we were over forecasting growth in the period after the financial crisis, and the chief economist asked why. I said I was voting for high growth figures, not because I believed that growth would be high, but because I thought inflation would be higher than the committee generally seemed to think. And in the structure that had been created, pushing up on the growth rate delivered a higher forecast of inflation. So there was an element of gaming to that. And the conclusion we then reached was that we needed to think about the supply side separately from the demand side. But anyway, a forecast inflation rate materially above the target in 2 to 3 years' time suggests that the interest rate needs to be higher at some point on the interest rate path. And of course, that doesn't resolve the question, should the interest rate go up now or should it be raised in the future. To produce a forecast which relies on the interest rate being raised in the future runs into problems because the committee votes on current monetary policy. It doesn't vote on future monetary policy, and there may be no agreement on what the future path would be. The Bernanke review, it was a review of forecasting in 2023 to 2024. There was particular emphasis on how forecasts can support policy making and communication. Bernanke certainly suggested a full set of infrastructure improvements, and he was very critical of one aspect of the forecast which I'd found when I joined the committee. It was more of a worry for people who joined the committee than after 18 months, but that was that essentially the forecast was produced incrementally, that this is what we had last quarter and this is what we think has changed. And of course, that completely ignored the question of whether the committee thought that the underlying reference point for the forecast was appropriate, and it wasn't really possible to say what the underlying reference point, what the starting point actually was, because there was an accrual of, if you like, shocks to the forecast, and the committee discussed the shocks and lost sight of the starting point. Now, you might say that as well as the need for infrastructure improvement, that pointed to the problems the MPC had in learning from its past errors, and Bernanke also wanted to help the MPC communicate its view, the risks around that, and the implications for policy. He was particularly keen on the use of scenarios, and here I found it quite interesting to see what the Armenians do with type A and type B risks, that the Monetary Policy Committee in esse first use of scenarios has focused on the effects of less emphasis on a wage price spiral and more emphasis on a wage price spiral, so that it can identify situations why inflation might fall faster than it had suggested, and also why it might fall more slowly. Those scenarios were distinguished from the central forecast, but the committee has gone on producing a central forecast, and as I say, I'd be very surprised if that changed. Bernanke seemed to have a particular dislike of fan charts. He talked about them being eliminated, which seemed to me the way someone might talk about a political opponent rather than a piece of guidance, a set out of information on the forecast. And there has been a bit of a backlash against that, but he certainly said, make use of scenarios. There's the question, running right through this, should the committee be producing a forecast of its future decisions? Bernanke suggested members could provide forecasts of their own forecast paths for the short rate, but he shied away from saying that the simulation should be produced using an interest rate reaction function, or that the forecast should be a staff forecast. The problem with rate forecasts is that they would be views on the required path for rates rather than forecasts on how colleagues would vote. And as I said, the required path for rates, there's a number of possible structures for that consistent with delivery of the inflation forecast. So this might work, it might not work, but I think actually it's perhaps a bit unlikely to be implemented. As I say, the standard problem seems to me that the committee could vote on that the committee can't vote on future interest rates, so the interest rate in any quarter depends on past and expected future rates, and the Treasury Committee certainly wouldn't want to lose individual accountability. So I think the Treasury Committee, this is the committee of the House of Commons that oversees the MPC, I think the Treasury Committee would be reluctant to tolerate an arrangement that seemed to put more power in the hands of the governor and the executive of the Bank of England and put less power in the hands of the committee. I think it's fair to say that in Britain, at least, the main support for a staff forecast has come from former staff members. And perhaps, to quote, Mandy Rice Davis, a witness in a famous trial, she said about someone, he would say that, wouldn't he? Well, the staff, I think, would say that, wouldn't they? While I was still at the bank, there was a proposal floating round that the MPC, that the staff should produce a forecast and the MPC should justify deviations from that forecast in some detail. Again, my view is that that would put too much power in the executive of the bank relative to that of the MPC, and there'd be a lot of resistance to that from the political establishment. Scenarios could be run with an MPC reaction function, even though, as I say, I have doubts about that with the main forecast. But equally, I'd say when the committee tried to describe its reaction function in the forward guidance framework that the Monetary Policy Committee set up in 2013, this was when Mark Carney became governor. When the committee tried to describe its reaction function, it produced something that most people found far too complicated. So I think if forecasts were scenarios are run with an MPC reaction function, there may turn out to be problems explaining that, at least if the reaction function is visible in any detail. Then I think there's also the risk that the scenarios may become a source of disagreement on the committee. And I've said that depends on the membership, that sometimes you have a committee where there are quite a lot of tensions. Sometimes you have a committee which is more cooperative and or tends to work together. In the first situation, which perhaps is less likely to arise now, I don't know. But in the first situation, you could easily see that scenarios, instead of helping to generate a consensus, would help generate disagreement. On the other hand, and I think Alan Castle's recent speech was a very good example of that, on the other hand, scenarios do help minority voters explain their positions, and I've said they give shape to risks. I suppose all I could say actually is that they give shape to some risks. And to a very good example, in the run-up to the financial crisis, the concern was that the United States was running a large external deficit and the dollar would fall sharply. And what would the implications of that be? That, I think it's fair to say, was identified as the main risk. And what was boiling away in the financial sector was off the radar of most economists, most of those involved in macro policy making. So you would expect help with some risks, but not help with all risks. Perhaps what's also relevant here that may be a complication, the Bank of England has a separate financial policy committee, and that is supposed to address the tail risks, or at least those as they affect the financial sector, and the question of what can be done to manage those. Now, whether you would want to put any of those into the MPC's scenarios, I'm not sure. I think if you have too many scenarios, then you would end up with just a mess. People will be able to focus on one or the other, and there'll be no connection between the two. So how far in practice that those scenarios will be helpful at identifying risks, I'm not sure. On the other hand, the reason that members vote in the minority is that they expect demand pressures relative to supply pressures either to be greater than the central point of the committee or to be weaker than the central point of the committee. And I can see the role for scenarios that illustrate that, but I wouldn't expect them to help with all risks. On the particular issue of model structure and the nature of FRB-US, I suppose I look at that with some amazement. A lot of experience in Britain, with the model that the Treasury used to produce with the Treasury model with other macroeconomic models is that you start off with something fairly straightforward, then you pin an extra sector on, then you pin a further sector on, and so on, and you're left with something that defies comprehension. I suppose when I look at FRB-US, I tend to think that that's gone down the same route. And what I don't understand is how the Federal Reserve Board avoids the sorts of pressures that tended to be found in Britain to simplify the model or to throw one version away and then start again with a new one. So there are questions about model dynamics that I'd like to know more about. So what are the conclusions I reach? Well, it's clear that there's substantial room for upgrading technology at the bank. The MPC, I think, is unlikely to give up its forecast. The idea that it should be produced just by the staff might have worked if that had started in 1997, but when the committee used to produce a forecast only for inflation, there was a lot of pressure on it to produce one for growth as well. In 2013, Mark Carney's view was that the committee should also be forecasting unemployment. It was actually a particularly bad time to start forecasting unemployment because the rate dropped in a way without any historical experience. But anyway, the committee produces those forecasts of 3 variables, and I can just imagine a hearing in Parliament where the members of the Treasury Committee would say to the MPC members, how can you set policy if you can't produce a forecast? Now, there are answers to that, but how satisfactorily they could be explained to a group of MPs is perhaps rather unclear. So yes, there will be a range of scenarios, but the MPC will continue with a forecast. There'll be more discussion of interest rate paths, but I think it very unlikely that there'll be a central forecast with endogenous interest rates, notwithstanding the problems that are created by using the market path in terms of the fact that the Bank of England's decisions obviously influence the market path. And in any case, what happens beyond the 2 to 3 year forecast horizon also influences what's going on in the economy. A forecast with endogenous interest rates is unlikely because the issue of voting on the current interest rate and voting essentially publicly is so strong now. I would say that fan charts are likely to survive, but they may well be complemented by other accounts of risk of uncertainty. And I think Bernanke was quite right to make the point that essentially since Mark Carney had become governor, the committee, and this may have been true beforehand, I can't remember, but the committee put very little time into the discussion of the fan charts. And if you're to produce fan charts, then they should be done properly. As it is, what I think they do is summarize the historic forecast experience, and there are questions about how you trim out extreme observations and so on. So there are questions over the production of the fan charts, but they do seem to me a good way of indicating the uncertainty surrounding the forecast And provided a central path is also shown, which it is now, I think that the fan charts will continue to exist. So those are my observations on the MPC and the Bernanke report, but we'll have to wait and see what actually happens.
Right, Martin. Thank you for your thoughts on how the Bernanke report may actually change things at the Bank of England. So, am I to understand correctly that you're saying that there will likely be a range of scenarios published, but they'll likely not be as prominent as, for example, for the Armenians are doing right now, where they're really at the center?
I think they probably will be less prominent than is being done in Armenia. I mean, as I say, I was very interested to read about the type A and the type B risks. Essentially, the scenarios I think will be used by the individual members of the committee who want to illustrate their own personal positions. And of course, that's done by in Armenia by saying whether you think type A or type B is more likely. It may turn out, of course, that as members make more use of the scenarios in their individual speeches, so the scenarios do gain in prominence. That seems to me perfectly possible.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Doug, I'm sure you have something to say about this.
I do. Thank you, Martin. So the development of FPAS, central banks, started with my work actually in the late 1980s, okay, where there was a recognition that we never used the word monetary policy as setting the interest rate, that we recognize that what monetary policy is a commitment to adjust the interest rate sufficiently to provide an anchor for inflation and inflation expectations. So we wrote down analytical frameworks where it was impossible to peg the interest rate. That was based because a lot of us were trained on Milton Friedman's 1968 presidential address, where this wasn't even his idea at the time. People had known it for decades earlier, that if you try to peg the interest rate, you try to, like the Bank of England does, it has a scenario where with a constant interest rate. So that's like pegging the interest rate. Now, you may recall that during COVID, when inflation had risen to double digits, they published a scenario where that interest rate pegged at, it was something like 1 or 2%. I think Charles Goodhart called it, he had some great language to describe it. The reason is that if in the aggregate demand equation, that depends on the real interest rate, and if aggregate demand goes into the inflation equation, if you try to peg the interest rate and you go into a high inflation, that means that your real interest rate is going to be going really negative. And of course, that's going to stimulate aggregate demand further and raise inflation further. So this has been known for decades and decades and decades. So FPAS central banks recognize that monetary policy is not just about setting the policy rate today, it's about influencing the entire path of the expected path of the policy rate in the future, because that's what's really consistent with what is influencing longer term interest rates and the exchange rate, of course. Now, the Bank of England is a non-FPAS central bank. There's a few advanced economy central banks that are still non-FPAS central banks, but by far the majority now of central banks have developed forecasting and policy analysis systems that incorporate this very basic principle that the central bank is accountable for adjusting its instruments, not just today, but also providing some forward guidance in the future to influence long-term interest rates, to influence the real economy, to provide an anchor for inflation and inflation expectations. So I I just don't understand. It strikes me, Martin, that if you continue, and I mean people in the UK continue to think that they somehow all have to agree on a number on every one of these numbers, it's going to be impossible to move forward, as all these other central banks have done, starting in Canada in the early 1990s, and then New Zealand, and then it spread to the Czech Republic. And then once you had those bases set up in those regions, eventually Chile, and then of course Chile infected Latin America, the Czechs infected Eastern Europe, and of course we have some good flexible inflation targeting central banks in around New Zealand, right? In Philippines and Thailand and so on. So I'm confused by this whole language of thinking about monetary policy as something that you adjust in the future, as opposed to thinking that monetary policy is a commitment to adjust things in the future.
Well, the way I would describe monetary policy, setting the interest rate isn't the same thing as fixing the interest rate independently of what's going on. The trouble you face is that different members of the committee will have different interpretations of what they think is going on, that when inflation picks up, some people may think that there's likely to be a wage price spiral triggered. Others may think that actually, as happened in 2011, 2012, when demand was weaker relative to supply than 10 years later, as happened then, the inflation will just fade fairly quickly. And we had 4.5% inflation, which just dropped out of the system because it was essentially the effects of import prices, and those then weren't reflected in wages. That's quite different from the situation today. So thinking of the practicality of it, I mean, possibly the committee could agree on a reaction function. The experience of 2013 wasn't terribly satisfactory. And the problem, of course, you face with forward guidance is that when the world turns out to be very different, then the reputation of the guiding institution can be badly damaged, which is why I think institutions like the Fed and the Bank of England have said that policy is data dependent. Data dependent by its nature means that you're reacting to what's happening and to what has happened, and not giving too much of a view about what you think is going to happen. I rather agree with you that there's a balance between the importance of explaining it to the public and the sort of technical aspect of the production of the forecast. But I certainly think in the UK, the concept of individual accountability is very strongly entrenched, and particularly on some occasions, that would create difficulties in essentially building a reaction function into the central forecast.
Perhaps I can jump in here, because I think this discussion about we're only setting the current cash rate is misleading. And the way I see this is there is a yield curve, and that prices mortgage rates, small business rates, loans throughout the economy. In Australia, kind of 2 to 3 year rates are actually the ones that do it. And the market has got a reaction function embedded already. And so you can't just say, we're not saying anything about it. It's out there already. You actually have to have a view. And that's why you get into these rather circular discussions where the central bank ends up trying to nudge the market expectation about the future and what their reaction function is. I think, so what that means is, yeah, your reaction function is out there, or at least a reaction function is out there. And you need to have a view on that because that's actually what's affecting it. The cash rate affects the overnight rate, whatever you want to call it, affects practically nothing in the economy. But through the yield curve arbitrage, it affects a whole lot of more interest rates. And that's where all these expectations come in there. So I think, it's out there. You've got to take a stand on it. Central banks do implicitly, but they're trying to have a bob each way when they say we're data dependent, which is really, I think, about trying to avoid accountability and getting tied down by forward guidance. But there is an expectation, and the market has got that embedded in pricing. So I think perhaps it's just easier to be transparent about that and acknowledge that, and it's out there already, rather than try and avoid accountability for it.
Martin, the reason I put this chart up, if you look at those ones with the green, okay, like Chile, Czech Republic, Sweden, New Zealand, just pick the first four because they're very seasoned. They've been doing FPAS Mark 1 for a lot of time. They've been publishing paths for the policy rate for a very long time. Like New Zealand started, for example, in 1998. What evidence do you have? Because I've heard non-FPAS central banks say that if we do this, that the people are going to think that we're committed to it. These central banks that have done this, explained this to people, they haven't observed any problems whatsoever. So what evidence do you have based on history that bad things happen when you do it this way? Like when you actually have a reaction function to produce a scenario. You can always add judgment if you want to, but that's what these guys are doing on the screen right now, and they've been doing it for years and years.
Well, it's not quite answering your question, but no, the MPC had committed to a program of asset purchases during the epidemic, which continued until the end of 2021. By the summer of 2021, quite a lot of people were saying that the policy was adding too much demand, that actually inflationary pressures were building up, and wouldn't it be better to stop? And the Bank of England, the MPC, felt that it couldn't stop because it had made a commitment to carry out these purchases, and also that it couldn't tighten monetary policy while it was still making purchases. So although it was one of the first institutions to start putting up interest rates, it nevertheless felt handicapped by this. Was it a commitment? Was it guidance? Well, perhaps it wasn't clear, but it certainly felt handicapped, hamstrung by that.
Actually, this leads me to make an observation about why do you use scenarios and what's going on. People talk about uncertainty and managing that, but I think what it's really about is the flexibility to change your mind. What you're really doing is trying to create a system in a way that you can allow humans who are always anchored on defending whatever they currently believe, to allow them to change their mind when the circumstances change. So I think one way of actually thinking about why do we talk about uncertainty and scenarios is not so much that we can actually treat them mathematically that way, but it's a useful framework to allow you to change your mind. So the example I want to give is, everybody made basically the same mistake around COVID, which was, it's going to be temporary, it's going to persist, and so we hold interest rates down for a while. And in Australia, we were no different. Indeed, I think we were one of the latest to take off. But at least my view was, actually, I do want to hold it low for as long as possible. But when we're going off like a rocket. So this was very much a case of, I was not a perma-dove. I was a case of, there's lots more context around this, but it was basically changing my mind. And when I change my mind, I'm going to be basically jumping to a very different path in the future, rather than, I think, people who are anchored on defending their previous decisions would be inclined to move much more slowly when you do take off. And I think if you can say, there could be two states of the world that will be revealed in the future. And if we realize that we're in this high inflation world, as we all did, what we're going to do then is we're not going to try and, defend or justify our previous position and be perma-doves. We're going to say, no, now we need to move very quickly and we're taking off. And if you have at least put the statement out there ahead of time that there are two states of the world that could be there, and you say, yes, I was wrong, I've changed my mind, and now I'm going to not compound that error by being wholeheartedly behind this new position, I think you end up with much better policy. And I think you actually can explain it better because you've already telegraphed it ahead of time, saying, this is what I believe at the moment, but when the facts change, I'm going to change my mind and policy is going to follow.
Well, if I could say on that, please, that no, one of the things that constrained the Bank of England was the belief that it shouldn't raise bank rate very rapidly. So we had, we were used to increases of a quarter point. This is very different from Britain's history, when the bank rate in the 1960s and early 70s sometimes changed by 2 percentage points on one day. It would go from 5 to 7 or something like that. And in July 1973, it was raised by 2 points at the start of the month and another 2 points at the end of the month. So we have got used to interest rates that are slower to move. Now, you might say that the sort of speed you would have wanted could have been done by 4 half-point changes coming on each other's heels. But I suppose I would have preferred an arrangement where, having carried on with the asset purchases, the rate was then increased by 1 percentage point in one go. But on the question, this scenario shows what we would do if we were wrong. Then that raises the question of how you catch up from getting wrong to getting, to putting things back on track. Maybe that's dealt with by discourse round the scenarios, but I think that issue would apply whether you have an endogenous bank rate or an exogenous bank rate in your forecast. I agree with what you say about the 2-year rate being probably the most important in Britain. There are some rates that are based on the 3-month rate, but people do increasingly take out 2-year mortgages now, and some of them are longer than that. Historically, mortgages in Britain were always at a floating rate.
Right. Thank you. Are there any questions from the audience? Because we're nearing the end of this panel, and I think it would be very interesting to see if there are some questions from the audience for the panelists. Please, if you're in the audience, to speak up or raise your hand via Zoom.
Okay. Hi. I don't have a question, but I do have an observation, and I just wanted to again re-emphasize the point that John made about policy agility. I mean, to some extent, with FPAS 2, the motivation is to embrace uncertainty, right? And then you're trying to somehow internalize that in your decision making. But ultimately, the objective is really policy agility. Is that if you want to communicate that, one, we don't know what the future state of the world would be, and secondly, that if a certain state of the world does materialize, then the central bank, has sort of processes in place so as to very quickly respond to that state of the world. And I think this comes back to how the discussion started about, emphasis on humility. And so I think, there is a full circle there in some sense. But when we think about policy agility, an assumption that we are making is that with this FPAS 2 framework, somehow it provides you those channels through which you can be more agile. And of course, John already said about something, there is an issue of less inertia. If you've already talked about these stages, these different scenarios, maybe it's easier to change your policy path. The analytical framework has also already looked at these different scenarios. But I think what is still missing is to see whether this framework does indeed turn out to be more agile in operations. And of course, this is something that we've not had practice so far, and maybe the Armenian example in the future will provide some experience of if it does, prove to be more agile. And maybe Armin, you can talk about if you already think that you've been able to sort of change policy course because one, there has been more communication about these different scenarios. There's more analytical work done about the path of monetary policy about these different scenarios. And one other thing that Doug mentioned also in terms of, what monetary policy should be, it's not about just the setting an interest rate path, but a commitment towards this medium term, inflation expectations. And in that aspect, the way I sort of think of as FPAS 2 is really this unconditional forward guidance. All you're saying is that irrespective of whatever state of the world you might end up in, what the central bank is communicating is that they are going to sort of have this kind of monetary policy response, such as to anchor inflation towards. So in terms of the communication, that's really the message that is being sent to the market. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Umang. I think on the first question on the policy agility, first, we talked about this during the previous session. I think John's point in terms of the agility has been clearly seen in the case of Fed in 2022, because I think just to start doing the right thing, they had to go for so much pain because they had basically heavily relied on this transitory story. So I think it was incredibly costly for them because they sort of have committed to something. So they had to first to uncommit, so to speak, and then do the right thing, which I thought was very problematic. Now, in our experience, in terms of the policy agility, of course, it's too soon to tell, but I think one thing which is clear is that it certainly helped us to be much more transparent and communicate in a much more clear way, which I think at the end of the day is going to lead to more agility. And this is, I think, one thing which is important to mention. When we were first, I think, presenting this doc to Larry Summers, I think it was a year and a half ago, and we asked this. We basically presented the framework. I think the first question he asked was, "Okay, so you're a small open economy, so exchange rate is such an important variable for you. So how are you going to deal with these issues? How is your FPAS Mark II, the scenario-based analysis related to the exchange rates?" And our answer and the practice is that it in fact allowed us to be much more clear about the exchange rate, because before that we have been so reluctant to publish anything forward-looking on exchange rates because of exactly of these issues that we're talking about, because it could be interpreted as a commitment, forecast, or whatever. So, but right now, after we have this scenario-based analysis, we could actually explain what does it mean. We could actually drive this into endogenous monetary policy rate. So we actually now publish the forward, looking scenario-based exchange rates, interest rates, and we talk about the market in a very transparent way. So in this sense, I think it's going to lead to more agility because we just have much bigger choice and color when we talk to the markets, and so we intertwine these possible reversals in our scenarios, right? So, for example, when we were talking about in case of Armenia, inflation has been quite low for quite a while. And so there was always a question how quickly you should decrease your interest rates, right? And so in many cases, the case A scenario was discussed that, in many cases, there is a case A scenario where, you might actually need a policy reversal if you think that inflation battle is over, but you still have some underlying factors. For example, that's true right now in the US as well. Now, see, in these kind of scenarios, I explicitly talk about possible, problems with inflation, which could lead to some policy implication. So it's agility, I think, sort of built in by design in this framework.
Right. Thank you so much, Armin. In the interest of time, I just want to move to the final panelist who has a presentation about endogenous credibility. And then we're going a little bit over time, so then we're just going to have to postpone the coffee break a little bit, but we can make that good because the next session will be a bit shorter. So Ani, can you do the honors of doing the final presentation? That's part of this panel.
Yeah, thanks, Jory. Hi, everyone. So we talked about this credibility thing many times, and it's a central idea for the FPAS Mark II framework. And my story will start by introducing the recent events. So since pandemic, many central banks, including Fed, have faced a series of stagflationary forces, and for the most part, they were hesitant to respond because most of them, including Fed, have firmly believed that these forces were indeed transitory. And as a result of that, as a result of this hesitation, it costed them inflation expectations, high inflation expectations to be embedded in the economy, resulting in an increase of the in the sticky prices as well as high neutral rates. Critics like Larry Summers as well as Mervyn King have warned them about these incidents, and I want to highlight the remarks by Mervyn King about having the need for the models which incorporate the endogenous nature of policy credibility. The idea is that credibility is not something which is given exogenously, but rather is shaped by central banks' own actions to meet the policy objectives. And the cost of credibility can be high economic vulnerabilities, including worsening of inflation output trade-off. As an example, we can think of the Bank of Israel's case in the start of the 2000s, in the early 2000s. So after the bursting of dot-com bubble, in the face of weakening economy, they had to stimulate the economy by decreasing interest rates, and it transitioned into the depreciation of currency, increasing inflationary forces in the economy. But inflation, these forces were intensified over time, and they reached up to 7% by the mid-2002. And they were really hesitant to take a decisive action to prevent this incident. And after only 5 months later, when inflation spiked up to 7%, they started to increase their interest rate. But it raised skepticism among the public about the policy's true intentions, raising the risk premium and further depreciating the currency and increasing inflation. So they had to remain their policy stance pretty tight for an extended period until the mid-2003, about 9%, to curb these inflationary forces and regain credibility. So this is the episode where they lacked credibility, and their policy was very costly in that matter. And another similar episode we can bring from the same Bank of Israel at 2006, when they already had accumulated some credibility. And in this period, they faced similar shocks, stagflationary shocks coming from increased oil prices and depreciated currency. And this time, as opposed to the previous one, it didn't require from them to raise the interest rate as much to curb the inflationary forces and anchor inflation expectations. Credibility, we can think of credibility as a stock, which is easy to lose and hard to gain. And there are obviously some exceptions to that. For example, if we look at the Bank of England, in the May 1997, they gained their independence. And because of having strong monetary policy committee with clear objectives, they managed to get a high credibility, to increase their credibility in a less amount of time. So having the need of these models which incorporate endogenous nature of credibility is really important, and I will present one of these models that is in our paper. So this paper is going to be Oxford paper written by Haika Zigitian, Douglas Laxton, and Shalvan Mokhadishvili. And in this paper, we incorporate a model which consists of linear and nonlinear parts. Here, what you can see is the transmission mechanism through which the model works, and this is a simplified representation of a much more complex process through which monetary policy affects the economy, mainly through prices and interest rates. But in the real life, it is far from straightforward, as we omit the significant complexity known as the endogenous nature of money creation. But instead, we have acknowledged that the monetary policy extends the beyond current setting of the interest rate that has been decided on any given decision day. And we incorporate the expectations theory by employing the long-term effective rate affecting the output. And this is a combination of interest rates with different maturities. And we also take into account the corresponding term premiums. And also we have here exchange rate dynamics, where exchange rate not only depends on the fundamentals, but also has it depends on the historical patterns as well. And our model, because it is semi-structural, allows us to be as flexible to include this backward-looking dynamic. And finally, we have inflation forecast-based reaction function, where inflation forecast influences the policy rate. And these reaction functions performed pretty well in case of the moderation periods. But when we think of the economic turbulent times like global financial crisis, their limitations become pretty evident. And here we include nonlinearities as well. So the first nonlinearity is the convex Phillips curve, which is being introduced, the nonlinearity is being introduced by the output gap term. And so if we look at the right-hand side, as the output gap approaches its maximum value, estimated usually to around 5%, then inflationary forces are intensifying and inflation accelerates. And this can be described by the fact that firms are reaching their capacity constraints, and so it transitions to higher wages and prices. As an example, I can bring 1970s inflationary forces in the US. Moving to the central part, we can see as the output gap is near zero, Phillips curve gets linear. And here, this period is being described by moderate inflation at output, such as the great moderation that we had by the end of 1980s till global financial crisis. And in the left part, we can see that this case is being characterized by the low inflationary trap and challenges like zero lower bound. So this is more relevant for countries like Japan or those in the euro area. And in this part, Phillips curve flattens. Next nonlinearity is the loss function, where the monetary policy penalizes the inflation deviation from its target, as well as the output deviation from its potential level, to prevent decrease the amplitude of the business cycle, and also the wild swings in the interest rate to smooth out the policy path. So here we can have symmetric loss function, but there are some patterns for certain economies like the US, where we know Fed has a dual mandate and it cares for unemployment. And in these economies, we will have asymmetric loss function, where we include the negative deviations from of the output. So next, finally, is our credibility. In the linear models, credibility is often assumed to be perfect, which is far from reality. In reality, credibility is based on how well the medium and long-term inflation expectations are anchored. If those forces consistently deviate and persistently deviate from target, it erodes credibility. And this depreciation of credibility can result in two major problems. First, inflation can be more persistent in that case, and also inflation expectations are ratcheting either upwards or downwards. So these, the latter incident is captured by this inflationary bias here. So how do we evolve, how these expectations are being evolved? We are considering two distinct processes through which expectations are being formed. First, optimistic yet watchful. Here, people are giving positive weight on the idea that, on the perception that inflation will eventually converge to the target, such as 2%, but also factor historical patterns as well. And the next thing is the skeptic expectations, which are inclined to either high or low inflationary regimes. So people believe that inflation will move towards to the higher or lower inflationary values, such as 5% or -1%. And these expectations are mostly driven by the historical patterns. Any deviation of actual inflation from the expectations will create the error term. And through these forecast error terms, we define the probabilities of going to the extreme cases. So those are the cases that Olivier Blanchard has infamously talked about, and he called them dark corners of the economy. And when I showed the Phillips curve, these high and variable inflationary part in the right-hand side, as well as the low inflationary trap in the left-hand side, are indeed the dark corners of the economy. So those probabilities of entering to the dark corners of economy are defined by the share of the error terms in case of the optimistic expectations relative to the whole share. So the idea is that if the actual inflation moves towards the target, then this error term here in the denominator shrinks. So when it aligns with the target, in the extreme case, it becomes 0, making the probabilities of entering to these dark corners as 0. On the other hand, if we have actual inflation diverging from the target and moving towards either high or low inflationary values, we would have that the second term in the denominator, these forecast errors, are decreasing, and in the extreme cases, they will be equal to 0, making the probability of entering to the dark corner as 1. And also we put additional conditions. So when the actual inflation materializes in a way that it is lower than the expectations formed in case of high inflationary scenario, then probability of going to this high and variable inflationary regime will be 0. And again, if this actual inflation materializes in a way, then it will be higher than what we have in case of low inflationary regime, the expectations in case of low inflationary regime, then the probability to entering there will be again 0. So we separate, we consider two kinds of credibilities. The flow of credibility, which captures the short-term dynamics of credibility, and it is obviously modeled as an inverse of probabilities to entering to dark corners of economy. As those probabilities shrink, we will accumulate credibility over time. And there is a credibility or a stock of credibility, which depends on its past historical values as well as the short dynamics and, or I would say, the flow of credibility. So this stock of credibility enters to the model by being the coefficient of the expectations. So it influences the expectation dynamics directly by being the coefficient of the forward-looking dynamics here, as you can see. And we also have the inflation bias terms, as I have already told, which either increases or decreases inflation expectations when we have deteriorated credibility. Obviously, in case of perfect credibility, these bias terms will be zero. So we use 10-year inflation expectations data from bond markets to create these scenarios for the United States and Euro area in the period of pandemic. And we can see the difference between US and Euro area. US entered this pandemic period with different initial conditions. So Fed has had obviously higher credibility in that time, and the inflation expectations weren't as disanchored as in case of ECB. And we can see how, because of this higher credibility, Fed managed to rebound the inflation expectations around the target in less amount of time than compared to the ECB's case. And ECB struggled because of low credibility and because of the zero lower bound problem that they had for more than a decade. Now, let's see how credibility can be useful, especially in case of the economic turbulent times. In case of the normal times, when economy is not turbulent, when we have negative shocks like negative demand shock, the rational response from the central bank will be to decrease the rates, but to stimulate the economy. And as a result of that, inflation expectations will increase, and we will have depreciation of currency, and thus the exchange rates and interest rates will act as shock absorbers. So they will absorb the part of the negative demand shock. On the other hand, if we encounter with economic turbulent times, such as zero lower bound problem, there can be two cases. First, if we have credible active policy, and if we are encountering with negative demand shock, then we are constrained by this zero lower bound problem, then we can switch to use alternative instruments. Because if we are running out of monetary policy space, we can always switch to using unconventional measures such as quantitative easing, forward guidance, or even fiscal stimulus. And the result will be similar to the first case, where inflation expectations will increase, and this will decrease the current and future path of the real interest rates by depreciating the currency, and it will stimulate the economy. But if we have passive policy with low credibility, then we are constrained in both ways. So we are constrained by the zero lower bound on interest rates, so we cannot operate with our conventional measure, and we are also constrained in terms of our unconventional measure indirectly because we lack credibility. As a result of that, there will be increase in the real rates, and it will appreciate the currency, and here exchange rates and interest rates will act as shock amplifiers, so they will amplify the negative impact of the demand shock in the economy. So This is the case of ECB, as I told, where exchange rates and interest rates acted as shock amplifiers, as opposed to the Fed's case. We can see that comparing the inflation expectations for the two countries, we can see that in case of the US, the inflation expectations weren't as disanchored as in case of ECB, in case of Euro area. And also because Euro area struggled with zero lower bound problem after their debt crisis, after global financial crisis for a long period of time, for more than a decade, they couldn't manage to accumulate credibility in that period. And so as a result of that, they were constrained in both ways. They couldn't operate with lowering with their conventional measure by lowering interest rate to stimulate their economy, and also they couldn't switch to using unconventional measures as well. And we can see that while Fed succeeded in rebounding expectations to 2% target over time, ECB's case was harder, and their expectations kept drifting downwards. And as a result of that, the euro appreciated in that period by contracting economy even more. So we use our model to stimulate this case. So this is the June 2020 mock simulations for US and Euro area, and we replicate this scenario by having different initial conditions for Fed and ECB. While Fed enters this pandemic era with a 0.9 credibility, which is pretty high, ECB's case is harder because it enters with 0.7 credibility, and also the inflation expectations in the US is 1.5. Again, it's lower than the target, but still it is higher than what ECB had, which was 0.8. So you can see that Fed spends less amount of time in at the zero lower bound than ECB, and it manages to rebound expectations and converge it to the target over time, and it doesn't have much loss in credibility as opposed to the ECB's case. So we also did some illustrative case scenarios for US economy. This is for the November 2024. We have a market reference scenario here, which replicates the soft landing story. If we look at the Atlanta Fed's market probability tracker, we can see that although market nowadays expect higher neutral rate, but still we have this soft landing story to be prevalent. Also, we have case A, case B scenarios. In the case A scenario, we have we require to have higher interest rate path than what financial markets expect to anchor inflation expectations. And this scenario is being motivated by the fact that currently there are potential shifts in the US U.S. policies, in the policies of in U.S. Regarding the tax cuts, immigration policies, tariffs, and so on, as well as by motivated with the strong demand story, which is still relevant nowadays. We can see that we can say that this case A scenario is pretty important and pretty relevant for now. On the other hand, we have case X scenario, which is kind of the extreme case for the case A. And the idea is that Fed so the story is the following, that Fed follows the soft landing for a while and thinking that it is the correct thing to do. And after that, it realizes its mistake and tries to curb the inflationary forces, but it is more costly than in the case A scenario, in a way that Fed has to increase the interest rate far higher, and it should the interest rate path should be more persistent than in the case A scenario in order to curb inflationary forces and re-anchor expectations. And we also have case B scenario here, which is motivated by the fact that we think most of the increase of the asset prices is the bubble, and this asset price correction story can be pretty relevant in any minute. So this can actually create a room for case B type considerations. So this was it. Thank you so much. If you have any questions and comments, feel free.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Annie. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes, I see a hand.
May I hear it?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, please. So the credibility is important to avoid the dark corners as you presented, and that will result in a least regret policy. So as a central bank, what's the optimal behavior to avoid such situations? And I want you to highlight, if please, the benefits of FPAS Mark II in managing credibility, basically, or avoiding situations, how FPAS Mark II helps to avoid situations where we can observe severe credibility losses and find ourselves in dark corners, and find ourselves also in a regretful situation. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. As I said, credibility is central for FPAS Mark II framework, and by considering the avoiding of baseline scenario, which is one of the key components of our framework, we are replacing baseline with this case scenario that I showed. So we are addressing the risk related to these scenarios, extreme scenarios, and by weighting the risks related to this scenario, we are doing policy of least regrets. And instead of providing baseline, which can have drawbacks, so I want to highlight the drawbacks of baseline. The first drawback is that it provides a false sense of assurance to the public as well as financial markets that this is exactly what is going to be in the future, the scenario, and also it restricts the policymakers in their decision making. So we are not as flexible, and instead, there is two major problems with baseline scenario that I can highlight, because of which we are drifting away from baseline, and instead we are incorporating these case scenarios, and by incorporating we are also addressing the risks, which also includes the fact that we are worrying about our credibility. So also, communication that we try to employ is really hard compared to the FPAS Mark I's case, because communicating uncertainty is really hard with the public, because human nature is in a way that they dislike uncertainty. But somehow we have to manage to communicate this uncertainty, and at least to not add another layer of uncertainty about our policy. So This communication is really important, and it really increases the credibility and accumulates credibility. And by having a high credible central bank and transparent communication with public, this really makes our job easier in our policy making. It doesn't require for us to adjust the policy rate as aggressive as the opposite case. And yeah, I guess, okay, Doug wants to say something also.
Yeah, so back to Larry Summers. He raises this whole issue in 2021 that the Fed is, and not just the Fed, but they all suffered from groupthink. Like they all go to the BIS meetings, they have dinners together. They were all pushing the transitory line too strongly. Okay, so what would have FPAS Mark II been? Well, we've gone back. In fact, Larry Summers has said, if you guys want to really get into this, you should go back historically and look at many periods. So we've gone back through the US and looked at all the periods in the past where it would have been helpful. And we can tell you very, I think, succinctly. In 2021, if you would have had a case A and a case B, case A would have been one that looked more like the beginning of it. But you'd also have a case X. Case X would be closer to what actually happened and so on. And so you go back that period and say, look, if you were communicating that way, what's important? Financial markets don't wait for us. Don't wait for us to increase the policy rate. We are going to increase the policy rate in the future. So financial markets are much better prepared when in that period, if they would have FPAS Mark II, because interest rates would have tightened much earlier, as in Annie's chart. When sticky price inflation is rising, you better be raising the Fed funds rate aggressively. Otherwise, you're going to let people that set prices and wages, these things that are set infrequently, the price of an apartment, they're going to start raising prices because they have to catch up to the past, and they're not very confident about the future. So so we're teaching the new GFS students to focus on example after example after example. Now, will that be good evidence? Will it be good practice for teaching people how to do monetary policy correctly? Will it provide evidence? Well, if we keep on doing the United States in real time, yes, it will, because we'll be able to go back and say, this is what an example of the process would have looked like. And this is what, this is how you would compare it to the actual policy. So you could do this for the Bank of England. You could do it for, and we're focusing right now about half a dozen countries in the GFS, but kind of sporadically. In other words, they're just little lessons and so on. But I think there's already a little bit of evidence, but overwhelming evidence is going to take years, maybe a decade, before we'll be able to say anything definitive about whether or not it. But in terms of judgments, which is what you care about, as opposed to research that makes definitive conclusions. But I think you should already see that there's an ample amount of evidence that it makes much more sense.
And also I want to say add a little thing, which is important to grasp. Credibility is not only important in economic turbulent times, it is important always, but the real value of credibility, the true value, becomes apparent when we enter to these economic turbulent times. So we shouldn't ignore the credibility when we have like moderate times, normal times. We have to always care about credibility.
All right. Thank you. And I know there's still a question from Martin, but we're actually half an hour over time now, and that works perfectly with the schedule because the next section about Python and ChatGPT will be half an hour shorter. But it is time for the coffee break now. In half an hour, we'll come back for the session on Python and ChatGPT, and then after that, we'll be back for the next panel on FPAS Mark II. So thanks, everyone. for this interesting discussion about FPAS Mark II, credibility, the role of human capital, and we'll see you in the next session.